weeks, so I didn't hear the first couple of sermons in this series, and then I'm kind of preaching or speaking on the last chapter. So one of the handy things was this week when I kind of managed to get out in between the rain showers to be able to listen to the sermons back and hear what others have shared in relation to the earlier chapters of the book of Ruth was really helpful, so I'd encourage you to kind of avail of those. I just want to set some context because I appreciate not everybody will have listened to them, and I'm going to jump into chapter 4, and sometimes it can be tricky to know where we're at without some of the background. So Ruth is a book in the Old Testament of the Bible, and it tells this story of a family that had grown up in Bethlehem, which we know is this city of David, this place of blessing, but that area experienced a famine. And rather than waiting it out or sitting it out, this family, Elimelech and Naomi, decided that they would head off to another country where there was food. And they went along with their two sons, Mahlon and Chilion, and they settled in a place called Moab. And ultimately they spent time there because we hear that their two sons found wives, as sometimes people do, and they began to create a life for themselves there. The family experienced incredible hardship in the sense that Elimelech died, the two sons died, and so Naomi, the matriarch of the family, was left in Moab, a country that really wasn't her own, but she was almost stranded there as a result of these deaths. And ultimately she was left there with two daughter-in-laws, and so she decided that what she would do would be to return to her home nation, her home country, her home city. And so she sets off on that journey, and these two daughters-in-laws, trying to be the dutiful daughter-in-laws that all of us expect our sons to marry. They said, if you're going, we're going with you. And so they set off on this journey. But one of the daughter-in-laws realizes at some point on that journey, whether it be the thought journey or the actual journey, we're not quite sure from the text, but she begins to think, oh my goodness, this is a big step. This is going to radically change my life. I'm going to be in a country of foreigners. I'm going to be the foreigner in a land that I don't know, and she decides to turn back. But Ruth, this daughter-in-law, sees her mother-in-law and says, look, no matter what happens, no matter the cost, no matter the challenge or the difficulty that I'm going to encounter, wherever you go, I will go. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. And so Ruth and Naomi headed off back to Bethlehem, which was Naomi's hometown, so to speak. When they arrived there, they realized that they were destitute. There was no social welfare in ancient times. However, God had made provision for people in those times. So the social welfare state wasn't invented by a Labour politician in Britain. It was actually already embedded in God's thinking within the Scripture, because what happened in those days is when people reaped their harvest, they were instructed by God to leave the margins around the field and anything that fell whilst they were harvesting, so that the poor and the destitute and the marginalized could actually find sustenance in relation to their life journey. And so when Naomi and Ruth arrive back, Ruth heads off and begins to gather or glean some of this provision for herself and Naomi. And then ultimately what happened was the place where Ruth found favour in her gleaning was actually a near relative of Naomi's husband, Elimelech. And ultimately, in olden days, what would have happened would have been that if you lost a son, then the next male relative would step into the gap and actually raise up a family in the name of that lost son by taking the bereaved daughter-in-law as their wife. And so that's ultimately, I think, what begins to unfold in relation to chapter 3 of Ruth. And so Naomi recognizes that Boaz, this generous, kind-hearted individual, is beginning to kind of show favour to Ruth in relation to the journey that they've made back to Bethlehem. And ultimately she begins to set things up so that Ruth would actually build a relationship with Boaz at some level, and ultimately Boaz would recognize that she is interested in him being what the Bible describes as kinsman redeemer to Ruth. And ultimately she goes to the threshing floor. She makes her intentions known to Boaz, this honourable man. He said, of course, I would like to redeem you and your family. So what had happened was they had lost everything. They were destitute, and now the only way for them to recover all that they had lost was that a family member, a close relative, would be willing to pay the price to buy back the family line. And Boaz is all in. Not thinking about it. He's not having a... Do you know, sometimes men are a bit slow, aren't we? Do you know? Gosh, we look across a crowded room and see someone we might like, and then it takes us 10 years to ask them any questions, particularly Christian men in my experience. But that's another story. And so the scene is set, so to speak, for Ruth chapter 4, in the sense that Boaz says he does intend to redeem Ruth and Naomi, primarily to redeem Elimelech's land, which was the currency of the day, and as a result of that, take Ruth as his wife, and as a result of that, provide a lineage for Naomi, which is an incredible scenario. So I want to just share for a few minutes this morning, and here's what I'm thinking I'm going to do. I'm going to go through Ruth chapter 4, and I'm going to highlight just some things as we read the passage of Scripture together, and then I'm going to leave you with 3 thoughts that I hope will encourage you in your faith. But I'm going to do all of that under the title that Ruth chapter 4 describes: the difference the Redeemer makes. The difference the Redeemer makes. So let's begin in Ruth chapter 4. Verse 1, and I'm going to just break them down. I'm sorry the text, I thought I'd done that large enough, but maybe not, but I'll read it for you anyway. So Ruth chapter 4 verse 1, it says, Now Boaz had gone up to the gate and sat down there, and behold, the Redeemer of whom Boaz had spoken came by. So Boaz said, Turn aside, friend, sit down here. And he turned aside and sat down. I suppose one thing that I should have said was that it was the right of the nearest relative to redeem the land, and ultimately Ruth and Naomi. And Elimelech had a nearer relative than Boaz, so Boaz was all in. He had fallen head over heels for Ruth. He wanted to redeem her. He wanted to take her as his wife. But there was a nearer relative than Boaz. And so Boaz set himself in a place at the gate of the city so that he could do business in relation to the inheritance of Elimelech, and ultimately in relation to Ruth and in relation to Naomi. That was the place where business and legal transactions took place. He didn't wait for something to happen. It says he had gone to the gate and sat down there. He was intentionally positioning himself to actually do business in relation to what he had committed to Ruth when he spoke to her in chapter 3. Ruth chapter 4 verse 2, stay on that slide. And he took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, Sit down here. So they sat down. One of the things about ancient custom was they didn't have a written culture in the way that we do. So they had the culture of the elders at the city gate, being witnesses to transactions that took place. So not only was he saying, look, I'm here ready and willing, I'm going to catch this bucko on his way into the city, but he is also saying to the elders, you guys sit down here. Or one of them might say, I want to go and do this, sit down here. We have a job to do today in this redemption process, so you cannot leave until it's complete. So sit down here, and it says, so they sat down. In Ruth chapter 4, verses 3 to 4, still on that same side, then he said to the Redeemer, that was this person who had more right than Boaz to redeem the land, and Naomi and Ruth. He came by and he said to the nearer Redeemer, Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, is selling the parcel of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. So I thought I would tell you of it and say, buy it in the presence of those sitting here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not, tell me that I may know, for there is no one beside you to redeem it, and I come after you. And the Redeemer said, I'm going to redeem it. And poor old Boaz's heart must have skipped a beat, I'd imagine, you know. Gosh, that wasn't the plan. That wasn't what we discussed. That wasn't what Naomi had sort of schemed. This was like contrary to what they had thought and considered to be the case. Move on to the next slide. This then, in Ruth chapter 4, verse 5, it says, then Boaz said, the day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you also acquire Ruth, the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance. Basically, Boaz is working an angle here. He's saying you may want the land, but do you want the woman? Don't forget, the deal comes with Ruth. You see, it was not only the kinsman redeemer's responsibility to redeem the land. He also had to marry the widow so that he could raise children in her deceased husband's name. Her children would then get the land, not his. Ruth chapter 4, verse 6 on the same slide. Then the Redeemer said, I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption yourself, for I cannot redeem it. He didn't want to put his own wealth and standing in the community in jeopardy. He basically responds and says, okay, if it comes with Ruth, then her kids are going to inherit the land, and then there is going to be this conflict in relation to my future inheritance. Forget it. All he seemed to care about was his wealth and prestige. He could have gotten more land, but if it meant a conflict at some point in the future between the inheritance that would be given to Ruth's children and the inheritance that would be given to his own children, this nearest Redeemer said, forget it, because I don't want that to be part of the conversation around my life. In Ruth chapter 4, verse 78, it says this. Now this was the custom in former times in Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging. To confirm a transaction, the one drew off his sandal and gave it to the other, and this was the manner of attesting in Israel. So when the Redeemer said to Boaz, buy it for yourself, he drew off his sandal. In other words, it was like signing a contract today. Do you know if anybody's ever bought a house? Do you know the older ones will remember that? The younger ones are still hoping that someday that will be a possibility. But you'd sign a contract. You go into the bank or the solicitor's office and you'd sign it, and then it becomes your property. In the olden days, they didn't sign contracts, but this nearest Redeemer took off his sandal as a symbol in front of the elders at the gate and said, look, I am discharging, I am wiping my feet of any responsibility in relation to Elimelech's land, in relation to Mary and Ruth, in relation to continuing Naomi's legacy. I don't want that. And he removed his shoe symbolically to help us to all understand that that's what's happening. In Ruth chapter 4, verses 9 to 12, it says this. Then Boaz said to the elders and all the people, "You are witnesses this day that I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech, all that belonged to Chilon and to Mahlon. Also Ruth the Moabite, the widow of Mahlon, I have bought to be my wife, to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brothers and from the gate of his native place. You are witnesses this day." Then all of the people who were at the gate and the elders said, "We are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. May you act worthily in Ephrathah, and be renowned in Bethlehem, and may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, because of the offspring that the Lord will give you by this young woman." What's interesting there is the fact that they make reference to Tamar. Tamar in the Old Testament was this other narrative of this family that had a duty to discharge in relation to a widow, but actually Judah failed to discharge his duty in relation to the widow Tamar, and then she had to take matters into her own hands to ensure the inheritance of her children amongst the people of Israel. Really interesting read. But when the men at the gates of the city actually confirm this transaction, Boaz is becoming this kinsman redeemer, this one from the family who is buying back the land so that there can be an inheritance for Elimelech's children and for Ruth and ultimately for Naomi. He actually references Tamar, who is this other example of that duty not being discharged. So instead of shame and ridicule, the town leaders blessed Boaz when he redeemed Ruth. She was a foreigner, and there was a bit of a difficulty around foreigners in the sense of Israel's kind of purity and heritage. But here the city elders blessed Boaz for redeeming Ruth. He brought her out of a life of poverty and shame. He married her and made her his own, and they honoured him for it. But more than that, God honoured Boaz and Ruth as well. And so in Ruth chapter 4, verses 13 to 17, we read this. This is probably the quickest we're ever going to get through a chapter when I'm speaking, so enjoy. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. And he went into her, and the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. Then the women said to Naomi, wow, the women said to Naomi, this derelict, destitute widow who had no hope, no future. But then the women said to Naomi, blessed be the Lord who has not left you this day without a redeemer, and may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher to you of your old age. Your daughter-in-law who loves you is more to you than 7 sons, and she has given birth to him. Then Naomi took the child, laid him on her lap, and became his nurse. And the women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, a son has been born to Naomi. No, he hasn't. A son was born to Ruth. Why on earth did they draw Naomi into the narrative? Because the land, the inheritance, and the future were always Naomi's. It was her name. It was her family. It was her inheritance. It was never going to be Ruth's. Never. Under Old Testament law, it could never be Ruth's. It was always going to be this incredible story of redemption in relation to this old widow called Naomi. Ruth gave birth, but Elimelech's land was restored to the family. Ruth gave birth, but Naomi received back something that she could never herself have attained. They called him Obed. He was the father of Jesse and the father of David. Now, all of you know very well, I'm sure, that one of the amazing things about when we read the New Testament in the book of Matthew, in that chapter where it gives us that list of names that lead to the Messiah, there's a couple of women that make the list. Just 3. Don't know why, but that's the way it was. One was a prostitute called Rahab, who became the grandmother of Elimelech. Tamar is in that list because she showed favour to God. And then, as well as that, because Jesus comes from this line of David, ultimately Ruth becomes mentioned in the lineage of Jesus, the great Redeemer, because of the actions of Boaz, who was willing to buy her back at this time. So here are the 3 things that I want to send you home with. When we look at our lives, if we live our lives in dependence on God, then I think we first of all find recognition. We find recognition. I think Ruth, Naomi, and this whole narrative, this whole 4 chapters remind us that we are recognized because of the Redeemer, Jesus Christ himself. That we have hope and security. Maybe you're here this morning saying, well, my life doesn't amount to much. Maybe you feel a bit like Naomi or Ruth. Maybe you feel a bit destitute. Maybe you feel a bit marginalized. Maybe you feel a bit forgotten. Let me encourage you this morning, because of Jesus, you are recognized. Your prestige and the honor of your life is completely and absolutely grounded in the truth that Jesus Christ, when he died on the cross for you, has brought you into his family. So you are not on the margins anymore. You are not destitute anymore. That does not necessarily mean you're wealthy and driving a brand new car, living in a mansion, but what it does mean is our security and our recognition comes from him. John 1 verse 12 says this: to all who receive Jesus, who believe in his name, he gives them the right to become children of God. Ephesians chapter 2 verse 6 says, God raised us up with Christ and seated us with him in heavenly places. We are not marginalized off at the fringes. We are actually children of God this morning, because Jesus Christ is our kinsman redeemer. He came into the world. He was part of our family. We rejected him. We crucified him. He died on the cross. He rose from the dead. He ascended into heaven. And now he stands there with nail-pierced hands to welcome us into his family. The recognition, and the only recognition that matters in life, is that we are recognized by him. Children of God. Children of God. We find not only recognition, but we find resources, just like Ruth did. What an incredible story of how she found grain at the side of the field, how she found a redeemer in Boaz, how she found an inheritance in Israel. Outcast inheritance. What an incredible story. I read through the week a story that I just think is beautiful. Wealthy man and his son who loved to collect rare works of art, everything from Picasso to Raphael. When the Vietnam War broke out, the son went to war and died in battle while rescuing another soldier. The father grieved deeply for his only son. About a month later, there was a knock at the door, and a young man stood at the door with a large package in his hands. He said, "Sir, you don't know me, but I'm the soldier, one of whom your son gave his life for." He saved many lives that day, and he was carrying me to safety when a bullet struck him in the heart. He died instantly. He often talked about you and your love for art. The young man held out a package and said, "I know this isn't much. I'm not a great artist, but I think your son would have wanted me to give you this. The father opened the package and gazed at a portrait of his son. He stared in awe at the way the soldier had captured his son. In the painting, the father hung the portrait over his mantle. When visitors came to his home, he always drew attention to the portrait of his son before he showed them any of the great works of art that were throughout his home. When the father died, his paintings were to be auctioned. Many influential people gathered excited about the opportunity to purchase at the castle or Raphael, and on the platform was the painting of the son. The auctioneer pounded his gavel and asked for someone to start the bidding. The crowd scoffed and demanded the Van Goghs and the Rembrandts, but the auctioneer persisted. Who will start the bidding? 200, 100. The crowd again insisted on seeing the famous painting. Still the auction said, the son, the son. Who will take the son? Finally a voice said, I'll give you $10 for the painting. The longtime gardener of the father was poor. Couldn't afford anything more, and while the auctioneer continued to pursue a higher bid, the crowd became angry. The auctioneer pounded the gavel and sold the painting for €10 to the gardener. Meagre buyer from the second Nobel, finally on with the auction, but the auctioneer explained, I'm sorry, the auction is over. When I was called to conduct this auction, I was told of a secret stipulation in the will. I was not allowed to reveal that stipulation until this time. Only the painting of the son would be auctioned. Whoever bought that painting would inherit the entire estate, including the paintings. The man who gets the son gets everything. Guys, we've got him. We've got the son. And when you look at this story of Ruth, she got this kinsman redeemer who bought her back. And that was only looking forward to a greater who would come. Jesus. Jesus hung and died on the cross. He provided every resource for us. Incredible truth. That's the way it is with Jesus. He who gets the Son of God gets everything. When you receive him, you are welcomed into a new life. You receive the wealth of God himself. You receive all of the resources of heaven to live your life here on earth. So don't live in spiritual poverty. Remember, the wealth of heaven is yours. He who gets the Son gets everything. It's everything. Third thing I want to say is this. I think this story of Ruth, Naomi, and the inheritance not only reminds us that we are recognized, not only reminds us that we have resources, but it also reminds us that we have found a relationship. We have found a close personal relationship with our Redeemer. I love those lines, even though sometimes we might shy away from them. After Boaz had redeemed Ruth, it says he went into her and she conceived. They got together. And the inheritance was established with the birth of Obed. We've been called into the family of God. We are loved by God. He has given everything for us. And we have a relationship with him as a result. I love what Max Lucado said in a book, A Gentle Thunder. He said, there are many reasons God saves you. To bring glory to himself, to appease his justice, to demonstrate his sovereignty. But one of the sweetest reasons God saved you is because he likes you. In fact, he loves you. Sometimes we might want to talk all theological about that, but he just thinks you're great. I often imagine God in heaven with his wallet. Do you know, like my granny used to do, and he had pictures of me granny, pictures of me mother when she was a kid, he had pictures of me uncle, and he had pictures of all his grandkids. Just go, look, he's mine. Do you know, they had this connection. God didn't save us because he wanted to have an illustration for his justice. or he wanted us to fully understand his sovereignty. He saved us because he loved us. But one of the sweetest reasons, Max Lucado says, God saved you is because he is fond of you. He likes having you around. He thinks you're the best thing to come down the pike in quite a while. You know, the enemy comes to you tomorrow morning and the next morning and the next morning and says, God couldn't possibly be bothering you. Who are you? You'll go to work one day and you'll be thinking in there, gosh, where is God in the midst of all of this? Why on earth would God choose me? And we start to create a narrative around why he wouldn't want us. Actually, he already demonstrated that he wants us. He thinks you're the best thing to come down the pike in quite a while. If God had a refrigerator, your picture would be on it. If he had a wallet, your photo would be in it. He sends you flowers every spring and a sunrise every morning. When you talk, he'll listen. He can live anywhere in the universe, and he chose to live in your heart. Face it, friends. He's crazy about you. God loves you more than you'll ever know. And the best thing about being a Christian is being in close, intimate relationship with Jesus Christ. My dear friends, enjoy that relationship as you live your life this week, because he recognizes who you are. He has resourced you to be all that you can be. All of that is predicated on the fact he loves you. He loves you. You might sing that song. He loves us. Let's stand together. Oh, how he loves us. Oh, how he loves us. Oh, how he loves. He loves me. Oh, how he loves me. Oh, worship team are going to lead us in a song. Not sure if that one or something else. If you want prayer this morning, I want to encourage you just to come forward. Some of the leaders in the church will be here at the front. We're more than happy to pray with you. Isn't it amazing what James shared? Transformational moments at the front of this church today have carried a legacy into the Philippines, into India, into other places around the world, into lives people who are gathered here. We're not going to keep this going for a very long period of time, but I want to encourage you. If God has spoken to you, maybe you feel a little lacking in recognition this morning, come forward and receive prayer. Let God remind you that you are a son and a daughter this morning. If you're struggling with resources, maybe there are things in your life that are overwhelming you because you don't have the resources to meet them. Remember, the struggle isn't yours. Your resources are not your bank balance. Your resources are built on your relationship in Christ. He meets all of our needs according to his riches in glory. Do you know maybe you're struggling in your relationship a little bit? I just want someone to stand with you and pray. I want to encourage you as we worship together just to step into this space. I'm not going to make it easy for you. If you want prayer this morning, please come forward to the front. Please do that quickly as well as we worship the Lord together. He loves us. Oh.